You are listening to Lovely Talks Heavy. Hello everybody, and welcome to Lovely Talks Heavy. I am your host, Lovely, and I discuss everything I enjoy with regard to heavy music. Before I even touch the subject matter of today's episode, I must extend the hugest thanks to my friend Rebecca George. She offered up some new art for this podcast, and I was like, hell yeah, I would love some. And she delivered spectacular results. Thank you so much once again. I absolutely love this art. And if you, the listener, love it too, then you should give Rebecca a follow. You can admire more of her work at her website, RebeccaDGeorge.com. That links through to her store Envy page, where she has prints and an illustrated book for sale. I'll link to her social media in this episode's description. Be sure to check her out, put some of her work inside of your home, and give her all of the love because she deserves it. Thank you so much once again, Rebecca. You delivered beyond my expectation. Also, if another note before I even touch today's subject matter, if this episode is giving you a bit of a ASMR tingle, I guess, because my voice is, for lack of a better term, more sultry, you're welcome, I guess. I've been running into a lot of audio issues trying to record this podcast, and at the time that I'm recording this, I have no choice but to resort to this sort of more sultry sort of tone. So that's my explanation for it. Not that you really needed it, but here we are. But anyways, let's get right into it. One of my favorite genres of film is that of the heavy metal documentary. For one, it's a lot of fun diving into the history of this music genre, which, broadly speaking, I enjoy very much. For two, while there's plenty of literature out there, I have a hard time reading books. And I'm a much more visual person, so the information is a lot easier for me to process. For three, even if I did have an easier time processing the written word, I think I would still find the documentary more enjoyable because of the ethos involved in the making of that certain type of media. If an author writing about metal wasn't themselves a metalhead or involved somehow with the genre, I would have a harder time with the authenticity of the experience that the author is conveying. I wouldn't believe their words as much, and I probably wouldn't find it as credible. Which, needless to say, when I came across the documentary Metal: A Headbanger's Journey for the first time, I was stoked. An in-depth view of heavy metal's history was being provided through the lens of its own people. Sam Dunn, the documentarian, was bringing a sophisticated lens over heavy metal with his study of anthropology. He would later zoom in onto specific genres of metal music with the series Metal Evolution. What I'm going to examine specifically in today's episode is another banger's film production, Iron Maiden, Flight 666, where we're shown a more behind-the-scenes look into Iron Maiden's Somewhere Back in Time tour in 2008. I'm not going to focus on the live DVD portion of that video release, though elements of the live show will be discussed as there are pieces of that integrated into the actual documentary. Sometimes, when you analyze or review a piece of media or a piece of art, building your own framework can be a bit difficult. Sometimes you don't fully understand the text, as it were, and yet you still need to play the game of, how can I pretend I look like I know what I'm talking about? Sometimes you do fully understand it, but you have nothing new to add, really. Perhaps there's multiple different routes you can take in analyzing it, but there's no easy way to make it into a cohesive analysis that's understandable, but you still want to take all of these awesome routes. I was having a bit of difficulty approaching Flight 666 initially, in the vein of I did understand everything, but what else new could I possibly add? I had seen the film before and enjoyed it very much, but I wanted to sound halfway intellectual and actually talking about it when I revisited it for this episode. I was scrambling for articles discussing the film, but mostly ran into more recent journalistic accounts of getting the opportunity to ride at Force One, which is nice for the people that wrote those articles, but not nice for me and try to build a framework for this podcast episode. I'm looking for something more recent in terms of Flight 666 and not Book of Souls, you know what I mean? In revisiting the film, I watched it twice, once to sort of refresh my memory and get a feel for anything that might stick out and be worth talking about, and again so I could take an extensive amount of notes on this entire movie, which there are about 15 pages of notes that I took, front and back, college ruled, with increasing amounts of illegibility as the film progressed. I had to pause it many times over just so I could jot down every single thing. So, in the second time viewing this film over, it took me about 4 hours to watch it, and this film is nearly 2 hours, so yeah. And even after all that note-taking and all the hand pain that I suffered and endured, it was still unclear to me how the hell I was to approach this whole movie. Until somewhere inside my tired, exhausted brain, two of the right wires seemed to cross and something lit up. Something I did scribble in my notes was an offhand criticism I had about the documentary, in how I wished we could have had a more in-depth look at the fan culture that surrounds Iron Maiden, which I will be discussing later. But looking at that, coupled with my tiredness in that moment, I realized the one thing that I was seeing, but hadn't really seen, was the emotional response that this documentary engenders, both from its subject matter and from the viewer themselves. Perhaps I'm just a way empathetic person, but the fact that I watched this film twice within 2 days was draining. And not in a bad way, let me explain further. Flight 666 puts one through multiple experiences all at the same time. You're likely approaching the documentary as a fan of Iron Maiden yourself in some degree. You're vicariously, albeit temporarily, living the experiences of Iron Maiden both on and off the stage, and you get a taste of how different people in different parts of the planet express their love of Iron Maiden. You go through all that, and by the time the credits roll, you think, God, I am exhausted. Weirdly enough, even though you consciously know you weren't flying on Ed Force One for 6 straight weeks, you weren't in 21 different cities all across 4 different continents for Maiden's live shows, you weren't forced through the jet lag that changing time zones brings, you weren't pushing elbows with other fans to get a better look at Steve Harris pointing his bass at the crowd, this film makes you feel as if you were going through all of those different things in multiple degrees, through your own experience, through Iron Maiden's experience, and through the fans' experience, and maybe even a little bit of the documentarian's experience. I think it does a good job of excellently framing the full experience in a way where one might typically feel on a journey. Flight 666 starts out in media res, with the first stop on the tour in Mumbai, India, with the first song on the set list, Aces High, which pumps the adrenaline and matches the initial excitement one may feel when they're about to go on a journey or vacation, or in this case, a worldwide tour. The first portion of the film is a lot of establishing of what exactly is happening, because it's the first look at Ed Force One. We're looking at the big task that Maiden has set up for themselves at the time, and we're overall trying to settle into the experience. After you hit a certain point, I think you feel as you get the idea, you understand what's happening, and now you're just waiting for the tour to end, because you're tired, you're exhausted, but there's probably still some interesting lore about Iron Maiden that you still have yet to unlock. That's the sort of emotional response that I got, at least, from watching the film. Possibly, I was exhausted because I was watching the movie late at night also, 2 nights in a row, but let's be real. I think what was said about being put through multiple experiences at once in the space of 2 hours holds some water here. One more thing to note of the viewer's emotional experience of this film is this weird power that's held over you when you're watching the live bits of the movie. It's weird to say, and I've mentioned it already, but when it came to the concert portions of the movie, it felt like I was really watching the show. It feels like you're in the crowd, watching Bruce Dickinson run up and down the stage like a madman, mere meters in front of you, and when he does certain hand movements as he sings the siren song, you are hypnotized, you're throwing your metal horns up in the air, and you're singing along when Bruce tells you, and certainly you'd empty your wallet and give your firstborn up if he used that power irresponsibly. When the adrenaline calms down and we're cutting to more of the documentary behind-the-scenes stuff, you realize that you're sitting alone in the dark, watching this on your TV in your leopard print pajamas and oversized t-shirt you daren't wear in public, and you feel like a goddamn fool. I'm not sure if that's an overall effect of how well the film is edited, or if Iron Maiden are just that powerful. So these are some of the responses one has watching the movie. Let's look at some of the emotional responses within the movie, and since this is a documentary that focuses on Iron Maiden, I think it's only appropriate that we start with examining their emotional responses. Since Maiden are a more private group, that filters what we get to see in this film. Rod Smallwood, Maiden's manager, has an executive producing credit on Flight 666, so I can only imagine how much back and forth there must have been about what gets to stay in the movie. Surely there was a lot of interesting stuff filmed over the span of the 6 weeks of the tour, but I'm sure there were some hard lines drawn over what the at-home viewer would ultimately be allowed to see. You see this filter manifest almost in the initial reluctance of certain members of Maiden to the idea of being filmed. Even towards the end of the film, Adrian Smith makes the comment that he was dreading the whole idea of being filmed and followed around for the documentary, although being with the Banger Films crew turned out more pleasant than expected. This filter manifests again during the first press conference we see in the film. A journalist animatedly, and my opinion way too broadly, asks about the crazy stuff that happens behind the scenes that Maiden don't want anyone to know about. Nico McBrain and Yannick Gers jokingly respond, "Well, if we told ya, you'd know, wouldn't ya?" And, "We could tell ya, but then we'd have to kill ya." For those that are keeping score at home and that follow this podcast, you can jot those down into your bad impressions that Lovely has done thus far of rock stars. Anyways, ultimately, by the end of the film, I think that this journalist's question is sufficiently answered through what we get to see in the film, although it may not be entirely what this person hoped. The biggest emotional response we see Iron Maiden have is with regards to the pressure that they have put on themselves to put on this live show almost every other night to a new and younger audience. Of course, while the band are certainly used to this by now, they still expect nothing but the best that they can deliver in a live performance even at their age. There's a lot of anxieties that the band feel. Anxiety about getting this modified Boeing 757 plane in the air for the first time, about feeling physically well enough to give their performances 100% despite jet lag, despite feeling sick on some days, about having this documentary crew shoving cameras in their faces day in and day out for 6 weeks, and I would also argue an anxiety about preparing to weather the storm of fans that greets them every single time they enter a new country. Like I said, Maiden certainly have grown used to a lot of the stuff attached to being arguably the largest and most universally loved metal band in the world. However, the pressure remains to present themselves professionally and to make every single person seeing them on this live tour feel special and like they've had a good time. At a certain point, my thoughts wandered over to a comparison of this being sort of like a reality show, which, yes, of course, Maiden surely have oceans of differences between them and, say, the Kardashians. But what I found interesting was this idea of how the two frameworks are inverted almost, in a way. With something like the Kardashians, someone watching might not fully believe what the heck is happening, and even if it is all organically happening and unfolding in front of the camera, this presentation of a lifestyle from which the viewer is most certainly detached has some level of staging behind it. With Flight 666, the stage show that Iron Maiden are putting on is sort of the centerpiece around which the reality we see is happening. This may be me reaching or whatever, and if it is, you keep that to yourself, because I want to feel like I'm smart for 5 seconds, okay? No, it is sort of meta, me talking about this film like this and presenting this comparison, because this is a fully scripted podcast that I'm presenting as if I were organically speaking to you. But let's be real, if I weren't scripting myself, I would be saying and ah a lot, so, you're welcome for that. Let's get into the emotional responses of the fans within the documentary. There's a lot of very, to say the least, enthusiastic greetings that fans give Maiden in airports and just outside of hotels, to the point where the band almost have to walk outside with Sharpies in hand ready to sign anything that people shove in their faces. Well, it was personally a lot awkward to see that overwhelming response happen. One also has to remember that this amplified enthusiasm stems from the fact that a lot of the fans we see in this documentary are from places where they don't have much opportunity to see bands like Maiden often. So, when a golden opportunity presents itself to them, they hold on to it dearly and will not let go until that opportunity saws its own legs off. We see some interesting vignettes of fans throughout Flight 666, my favorite being of this little moment where the band are in Japan and we're shown this little girl says she would love to become Steve Harris's daughter. I just thought that was super adorable. What all of the segments of fans illustrates is the level of importance that Iron Maiden holds in their eyes. For a lot of them, Iron Maiden are gods, and having the opportunity to see them live is a religious experience, extending all the way to the priest known as Father Iron Maiden, integrating Maiden lyrics into his sermons, and the offhand comment a fan makes at a meetup in Melbourne just before the show, where she mentions that this meetup is an opportunity for fans to get together and worship on the altar that is Iron Maiden. This whole idea is perfectly summed up in what I think is one of the most memorable moments in all of Flight 666. After the show in San Jose, Costa Rica, we're caught in a moment with a fan who's holding a drumstick that Nico apparently threw into the crowd, and he's crying to himself, processing the whole experience. He blows a kiss to the sky and does the whole Father, Son, Holy Spirit hand motion thing before the documentary moves on to the next thing. Which, personal opinion time, spicy hot take time, whatever you want to call it, I'm of the personal belief that heavy metal isn't a religion and shouldn't be seriously treated as one. Which sounds weird coming from a Powerwolf fan of all people, but hey, I'm also not going to stop people from living their truth so long as nobody's getting hurt. Especially in response to a documentary that came out in 2009. We're getting way off track again. The point is that Iron Maiden are important to a lot of people, and there's nothing that anybody can do about it at this point. At some point in the future, when aliens invade Earth and destroy all of civilization because of the affront to existence that is the film Independence Day: A Resurgence, and when they assess all of the damage they've done, loot our rotting corpses, they're no doubt going to come across some literal shrines to Iron Maiden, decorated in outdated, degrading speakers looping "Hallowed be thy name." And one of the things they will confusedly jot down in their notes about humanity will be Iron Maiden, deities of this primitive species, surrounded by the question marks of their alien language. Let's get back on track. Again, a really interesting phenomenon that is observed in this film, at least by me anyways, is that when Iron Maiden hit the Latin American portion of this tour, it seems that with each successive stop, the greetings the fans give them gets increasingly more intense. The deeper they go into South America, the enthusiasm is magnified tenfold, and that can be staggering for the viewer at home who's most likely not used to that sort of attention and is living vicariously through Iron Maiden in those moments. Thankfully, though, Maiden are prepared for that sort of attention, so at least they brace themselves, and there's a little piece in the documentary that explains that they're having to brace themselves for the Latin American portion. So there's also a little bit of a view of how different cultures tie into how fans show emotional responses to Iron Maiden. The most noticeable one for me is when they're discussing their tour stop in Tokyo and how they're lavished with gifts from fans when they go to Japan. The sort of thing is just customary for the culture, where people give gifts, even something small. There's other moments where military and religious tensions are illustrated both past and present regarding Iron Maiden, which the fans living in those countries aren't very pleased with. There are powers at play that will hinder people's simple wish to see their favorite band because those powers don't fully understand or wish to understand what that means. So, those were the major emotional responses that the film engenders both within and outside of it. I could stop the episode here, but there are a few other things I want to point out. For instance, my main criticism of this film is that I kind of wish that a little more focus into the fan culture that surrounds Maiden could have been tailored into it. Sam Dunn is an anthropologist, and I can't help but wonder how the film would look if it had a bit more sophistication tied into it. Granted, that's just possibly my own wishful thinking rather than a failing of the documentary itself. And even if it were a failing, a perfectly reasonable counter-argument would be that it's difficult to pick and choose through hours and hours of footage to supplement what we were allowed to see of Maiden behind the scenes, and what we did see of the fans was ultimately the most interesting footage that was captured. Another would be that while there might have been handfuls of people in those crowds of millions of people that went to see Iron Maiden that could have added a more anthropological or sociological texture to the film, they either didn't know that a film was being made, they didn't want to be filmed, or there was not enough time to get to them, because the more enthusiastic people made it to the front of the line. Sometimes, also, people can get kind of very, weird about their love of certain things, metal included. And I don't mean just treating musicians as deities. There's people who think it's perfectly acceptable to treat their favorite celebrities as their own playthings, who are 80 layers deep into their own fantasies involving these celebrities and refuse to come up for air. If there was somebody, just one person, in that documentary who was showing off their fanfiction about making Steve Harris and Bruce Dickinson kiss, there would have been a cringy response, both in and outside of the film, and I cringe just thinking about it. Ugh. And quite perhaps, the ultimate point of Flight 666 wasn't to be a sophisticated look into the culture that surrounds Maiden, though we do get a very good idea of it. It's just a rare opportunity to get a look at the camaraderie and chemistry between bandmates, crew, management, and even a bit of the fandom, too. And perhaps it strives a bit to melt away the presumptions of godliness that one might hold about Maiden, and display them as the regular dudes that they are, while incidentally being chased and surrounded by people who think them the porters of existence for 6 weeks. And if someone like me wants to get a more sociological, anthropological look at certain bands or heavy metal in general, there's other banger films that do that, though quite honestly I've watched them all, so if you haven't, you can get a look at Global Metal or Metal: A Headbanger's Journey again. And there are some non-banger films productions out there that look at heavy metal. I mean, you could watch Until the Light Takes Us if you can resist punching your laptop or TV every single time Varg Vikernes or anybody from Dimmu Borgir show their faces. There's also the Behind the Music series if you prefer a more sanitized and formulaic approach. So, that's gonna do it for this episode of Lovely Talks Heavy. If you enjoyed it, share it with a friend, and if you didn't, share it anyways. What did you think of this assessment of Flight 666? Would you like more assessments of live DVDs or films about heavy metal? Engage with me on social media, goddammit. On Twitter, Tumblr, Instagram, YouTube, and Mixcloud, I am Lovely Metalhead. Follow, subscribe, retweet, tell me I'm pretty, all that good stuff, goddammit. Once again, thank you very much to Rebecca George for the wonderful art that you provided for this podcast. I love it dearly. Thank you so much. Give her a follow. All of her information will be in the description of this episode. And until next week, next Saturday, the next episode of Lovely Talks Heavy, you stay brutal, my friends. Bye!